have some important information that I want to cover. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kelly Petty, the superintendent of the Cuyahoga County Board of Developmental Disabilities. I've been superintendent for about a year and a half. And it's interesting times in our field. There are a lot of initiatives being talked about around the state. It looks like we have a really mix of people here tonight. But for those of you who either work in the field or who are parents, if you are talking with people from other counties, people down at the State Department of Developmental Disability, there's just a lot of discussion about trends in the field, things that are impacting the services and supports that we provide, and what the future might look like for services and supports to people with developmental disabilities. And so I've been learning as superintendent that it is sometimes challenging to communicate enough about what's going on. And we do have a couple of ways of communicating. I have a newsletter that comes out every 2-3 months, and we have our website. We have our board meetings. We have parent-teacher council meetings that I attend occasionally and update them. But I thought it would be a good idea to try something like this that would be a larger scale meeting, invite everybody and anybody that wants to attend, and we'll have enough time when I'm done with my presentation to hear from any of you or answer any questions that you have. And so that's really what the purpose of tonight's meeting is. I just want to update you kind of on the current state of things, things that are happening, things that are affecting us as we go forward. And so, as I said, there are a number of initiatives or movements that are taking place in the world around us. And I have been referring to this as the Convergence of Forces. You can go ahead and advance that, thanks. And these are things that are really sort of driving us to potentially change the way that we provide services and supports in the future. And there's actually 3 distinct movements that I want to talk about tonight. And what's interesting about them is they all have similar outcomes for people with developmental disabilities, even though they are coming from 3 different bureaucratic agencies. And they probably will have an impact on how we provide services and supports in the future. But it's also important that you know that the origins of most of these changes really come from the advocacy community itself and from people with developmental disabilities themselves. And as you probably know, people with developmental disabilities are increasingly having a voice and having a say in how they want to receive services and supports and what they want their life to look like and how they want to spend their time. And we're seeing at the state level, more and more people with disabilities are being included in large stakeholder committees, giving input directly to Director Martin of the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. And locally, we've seen a real push to get more and more people engaged in learning how to advocate for themselves. So there's a real movement out there with people with disabilities are, continue to learn even more how to speak up for themselves and how to direct their own lives. And so the origins of some of these changes really come from people with disabilities. Now, it's important to remember, though, they didn't necessarily originate here in Cuyahoga County or here at the Cuyahoga County Board, but there's lots of people around the country that have been pushing for some of these newer ideas. And just keep that in mind as we talk, that much of this did not originate here at the County Board. We're very proud of the services and supports we provide here at the County Board. We think in many ways we're on the leading edge. We definitely are a leader in the state of Ohio. We've found many innovative and creative ways to support people, and we feel like over time we have been very responsive to supporting people in the way in which they want to be supported, and we just need to continue to do that. Also keep in mind as I talk, the things I'm talking about are long-term shifts, even generational in nature. These are not the types of things that are going to change overnight or change tomorrow. I'm not going to stand here and say that today we're doing things one way and next week it's going to look different. These are long-term shifts and trends and things that are going to take a long period of time. So I want everybody to keep that in mind. Now, as I mentioned, these Convergence of Forces are coming from really three different bureaucratic entities or bureaucratic movements. One is called the Olmstead Decision. I'm going to talk more about that. One is called the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a federal agency that governs Medicaid, as their name implies. And then the Employment First Initiative, which hopefully you've heard of here in Ohio. And so those three things, as I said, they all have these two common outcomes or themes. And if you take away anything from my presentation tonight, it's that the future will include increased opportunities for employment and increased community integration. And things that the board will be engaged in from here on out will have that as a focus, that we're always looking for ways to increase opportunities for employment and increase community integration, and that as long as our trends are moving in that direction, we will be in good shape going into the future. But these, again, are things that originate with people with disabilities and people who advocate for them that are saying that they want these things. So let me just tell you a little bit more about where these initiatives are coming from. The first thing I want to talk about is called the Olmstead Decision. And you may have heard about the Olmstead Decision. It's actually been around for quite some time. It dates back to the 1990s. And the Olmstead Decision actually started in the state of Georgia. There were two women who had psychiatric illnesses, and they voluntarily checked themselves into a psychiatric hospital that was a hospital run by the state of Georgia. And they needed treatment, and so they checked themselves into this hospital, and they were there for a period of time, and they received their treatment. And after some time, their treatment team determined and wrote in their case notes that these two ladies, they weren't related to each other or anything. These were just two ladies that happened to be there at the same time. These two ladies no longer needed. Your mic yes, we working at it. The two ladies no longer needed the level of care provided by an institution or a hospital setting. And so their treatment teams noted this, but the two ladies were happy to hear this, and they said that their treatment team said they could safely and adequately receive their services instead in a community-based setting, that would be satisfactory for them. And so they were happy to hear this, but what happened was the state of Georgia did not have any community-based options available for these two women. And so they had to remain institutionalized. There was nowhere else for them to go to live. And so they waited, and they waited, and they waited. And these opportunities to move into the community just never occurred. And eventually they got frustrated and filed a lawsuit against the state of Georgia because they wanted to move into the community and there were no options available. And other people who were experiencing similar situations were in the same, other people were in the same kind of situation, and they joined the lawsuit because they were also frustrated. And so, long story short, this lawsuit worked itself all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1999 decided that people with disabilities have the right to receive their services in the community in the least restrictive setting possible to meet their needs. And this was rather a landmark decision at the time. And so even though it originated in the state of Georgia, all states across the country paid attention to it. And what's happened since 1999, we've seen a tremendous progression in the amount of residential supports available to people in the community. So if you think back to pre-1999, we didn't have nearly as many supported living type of homes in the community, small 4-person or less homes out in the community where people were able to live and receive residential support. And just like Ohio, all states have made tremendous progress since 1999 to make available community-based residential services. However, what's happened more recently, just in the last couple of years, the Department of Justice at the the federal level, is responsible for making sure that states comply with Olmstead. And what they said a couple of years ago is kind of, hey everybody, this doesn't really just apply to residential services. This ruling also applies to day services. And so that kind of got everybody's attention all over again, because we had not really been looking at Olmstead as applying to day services. And so the implication is that day services, or there also has to be opportunities for people to receive their day services in the community, and not just in sheltered or segregated types of settings. Now, it still does apply to residential services, and Ohio, in fact, still has a large number of large institutional style residential settings, and that is a concern for the state of Ohio as well. So Olmstead says people with disabilities need to receive their services in the community, in the least restrictive setting possible to meet their needs. So that's what Olmstead is about. That's one of the places where this push towards greater community integration is coming from. And what's happened recently is that the Department of Justice has visited several states where they have found some issues. So they have recently visited Rhode Island, Virginia, and Oregon. And in all three of those states, they have issued citations because they felt that those states did not provide enough options for people to receive their services in the community. And in Ohio, we've got our eye on this. There is the potential that the Department of Justice could visit Ohio. It gets talked about. It's talked about sometimes as if it's inevitable that they will visit us, but we're crossing our fingers and hoping that maybe they'll bypass us somehow. But if they do, they would take a look at both residential and day service options, and they would be making a determination about whether or not Ohio, the state of Ohio, has done a good enough job of making community-based options available to people. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a sheltered setting such as Parma AAC would be a target. It just means we also have to have enough opportunities for community-based options if people want to choose that option. So that's really what they would be looking at if they were to visit Ohio. And again, it's something that myself and all the other superintendents are keeping a close eye on and talking about, and we'll have to address in the event that the Department of Justice does visit Ohio. But that's where one of the movements is coming out of, is this Olmstead Decision, a push towards community integration. And it applies to residential and day services. The next place that is sort of impacting this push towards community integration is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, or CMS, which is the abbreviation. And just as their name says, they govern the entire Medicare and Medicaid program for the entire country. And because we access Medicaid funding for both residential and day services through our waiver programs, we are subject to their rules and regulations. So we have to pay attention to what they say. And they have some rules that impact us currently, and everybody talks a lot about Medicaid waivers. Hopefully you've heard at least that term, Medicaid waivers. But the true name for a Medicaid waiver is called a home and community-based services waiver. So when we say somebody's on an IO waiver or somebody's on a level 1 waiver, those waivers are really called they fall under an umbrella of home and community-based waiver. And the whole idea behind these waivers is that they are a way for people to receive services in lieu of or instead of receiving them in an institutional setting. And so by their very name and nature, they are supposed to be services that are provided in the community. They're supposed to be community-based services. And so this has always been a part of Medicaid waivers. We've been using Medicaid waivers in Ohio since 1991, so this is nothing new to us. But what's happened recently is back in March, the CMS kind of updated and beefed up their rules around some of these things. And so it's got, all states are paying attention to it. It's not just an Ohio issue, but there really seems to be an increased focus on what really is a community-based setting that would be a legitimate community-based setting to be able to utilize waiver funding. And so again, this is something that all states are taking a look at. Currently, Ohio has a team of people working in Columbus that's taking a look at all of our services, both, again, residential services, because we use waivers to fund residential services, and day services. And they are doing kind of an analysis or an assessment of just how much do they meet the definition of community-based. How would CMS look at all of our different settings, and would they say, yeah, this one truly is community-based, or this one it really is not, does not really meet the intention of the rule. And then by March of 2015, every state that uses Medicaid waiver funding has to turn in both this assessment and a plan for how we're going to address some of the settings that might not be community-based. So I mentioned earlier that Ohio has some settings, some residential settings that might not truly be community-based. There's also some day services settings that probably truly aren't community-based. I'm not entirely sure how our 8 AACs would stack up in CMS's mind. I think we have lots of features in our AACs and facets of our program that do emphasize community integration, and we do make attempts to have people go out into the community and participate in their community. But at the end of the day, CMS may come here and say that we need to do even more of that, or that our AACs don't completely gel with their idea of what a community-based setting is. So at this point today, I don't exactly know what they would say about some of our centers. But again, we are anticipating that as long as we're doing more in the way of these trends around community integration and employment, that we'll probably be okay. And so we're looking at ways, and I'll talk a little bit later when I talk about the strategic plan and the budget, about ways that we can make sure we are integrating people into the community as much as we possibly can. And it is challenging. The bigger the setting is, it becomes challenging. And so that could be one of the difficulties that we run into. Another aspect of this CMS rule that really is a little off topic. It doesn't really have to do with employment or community integration per se, but it's important for me to bring up tonight. It's a notion called conflict-free case management. And again, this notion has been around for a long time. It's always been a part of the waiver rules. But in March, when CMS kind of updated and beefed up their rules, they also seemingly are paying closer attention to this idea. And what conflict-free case management says is that the person that is working with an individual with disabilities and writing their plan or creating their person-centered plan with them, that person cannot work for the same entity or agency that is also the person's direct service provider. CMS views that as a conflict of interest. And what you have to remember is CMS is a big federal agency, and they work with a lot of hospitals, a lot of nursing homes, a lot of insurance companies, a lot of big entities that might make a lot of money, and they do have to worry about there being conflicts of interest. They're not necessarily thinking about Cuyahoga County, the county board system in Ohio, and how our AACs work. And so In Ohio, like I said, this notion has always been a part of the waiver rules. Ohio has always said back to CMS, we recognize that we have this situation because we have service and support administrators or support administrators. Does everybody know who our support administrators are? They're the people that work with individuals and help write their plan and help them to decide what kinds of services and supports they want to receive. So those folks work for the Cuyahoga County Board of DD. And then we have many folks that receive their services at a Cuyahoga County Board of DD Adult Activity Center. And that's the case in every county, almost every county in Ohio. So the state of Ohio has always said to CMS, we know that that situation exists, but it's not a concern, it's not a problem, and here's the reasons why. And they have on file with CMS a document that explains why we are not concerned about this conflict. And up until now, that has always been very much acceptable to CMS, and they've never given us a hard time about it. But we're a little concerned that with this issuance of new rules, that there's going to be an increased focus back on this, and that we are going to have to do something to alleviate this perceived conflict or this conflict. And one of the things that we may have to do in order to address that is to make a commitment to CMS that as a service provider, we, the Board of DD, is not going to grow or get any bigger than it is right now. That is my latest information on how that is likely to turn out. Again, the state of Ohio doesn't have to get back to CMS and make any commitments to them until March of next year, but that is the plan that is being talked about right now. And that's why I keep talking about this need for a transition plan. All states have to turn in this plan by March of 2015. So that could very well end up being a component of that plan. And I will definitely have to keep everybody updated on how that ends up playing out. Okay, the third sort of place or movement where these things are coming from is what we call employment first in Ohio. Hopefully everybody's heard of the phrase employment first. And technically, employment first is a state of Ohio initiative. But in reality, when Governor Kasich signed an executive order back in March of 2012, it's been 2.5 years ago already, he signed an executive order that stated that community employment shall be the priority and preferred outcome for working age Ohioans with disabilities. When he did that, he was not alone. Lots and lots of other governors around the country signed very similar executive orders at just about that same time. And currently, there are about 35 states who have some type of employment first initiative in place that's very similar to Ohio's. And so even though we call this a state initiative, it really is a movement across the country that most states are participating in some form or fashion. And employment first, I know when a lot of people, I have some excerpts this is from a DODD presentation that was actually from a couple of years ago. But a lot of people, when they hear about employment first, they hear people talk about it, and some people talk about it and they are pretty provocative and they really want to push the envelope. But a lot of people hear about it and think it means that every single person with a developmental disability is going to get a job in the community. And unfortunately, when people hear that, I think the whole movement loses credibility because people just don't think it's realistic. And so I believe what Employment First really says is that we just need to shift a little bit the way we look at people and the way we work with people when they are entering their adult life, or at any time throughout their adult life that they might want to make a change in what they're doing with their life. But the sort of the history of this is that there had been a perception, and it may not be 100% accurate, but it might be pretty close. But there's been a perception that people with developmental disabilities would go to school, and they would graduate from high school, say on a Friday, and on Monday they'd start their enrollment at one of our adult activity centers. and that transfer from school to adult activity center was almost automatic for almost every single person in that school with a developmental disability. And no thought was given to, would this person like to do something else? Would this young person maybe want to work? Do they have the skills to work, or could they pretty easily get the skills to work? And what is it that they want to do? And should we not stop and ask a few of those questions and really take a look at whether or not that's a possibility for this person before we make this automatic assumption that their only option is to go to a sheltered environment. And so that's, I think, what the challenge of Employment First is to work with people a little bit differently, raise our expectations of people a little bit, and make sure we're really asking those questions of people about how they want to spend their adult life. Do they want to work? Do they want to go to a sheltered setting? What is it that they want to do? And that we're really trying different things in different ways and making sure they know what their options are before we say, okay, you know what, this working thing might not be for you. It's okay for you to choose to spend your time another way. But we have to ask those questions, and we have to not assume that we know that every single person with a disability will not be able to work. The way we've done it up until now, it's almost like working and being part of even our community employment program was the exception, not the rule. And what Employment First seeks to do is kind of flip that around so that not working should be the exception. Not meaning that every single person is going to work, but we at least have to ask that question and explore that possibility and give it a really good try, and not just kind of go through the motions.